Welcome back to our course, Understanding Doctrine, an Introduction to Christian Theology. I'm Pastor Chris Lent from Celebration Community Church in Celebration, Florida. For more information on our ministry, or for any questions that might arise when you're watching these videos, please feel free to email us at info@44life.com. Over the next two sessions, we're going to quickly cover some of the attributes of God. We're still using this overall taxonomy of God's absolute attributes. Those are the attributes that belong closely to his essence without as much overlap with his creation, and his relative attributes. Those attributes of God that are more clearly seen in his relationship with creation. Those attributes that are more shared in common with humanity. Now, a few qualifications here. First, there is no definitive list of God's attributes. Different theologians highlight specific attributes. Sometimes different names are used for the same realities, and sometimes different subgroupings are utilized. So in our introduction here, don't imagine that the names or the attributes that I give you are exhaustive. Second, a number of attributes blur the line a little bit between our taxonomy of God's absolute attributes and his relative attributes. So know that these aren't hard and fast categories. For example, God is omniscient, which means he knows all things. We aren't omniscient as human beings, yet we do have the capacity for knowledge. And so there is some correspondence between God and humanity when it comes to knowledge, but it's a very lopsided correspondence. All that to say, don't make this taxonomy between God's absolute and relative attributes too rigid. Third qualification, every one of these attributes, of course, deserves its own hour-long lecture in order to grasp each of them sufficiently. I can only list them here and provide a brief definition and give a scripture reference or two. But that's not enough to really truly understand, for example, the love of God. But I leave it to you to do some more in-depth study on these attributes. And if you want more resources for that kind of study, please feel free to email us, and we'd be happy to point you in the right direction. But here are three trusted works on this topic of God's attributes that you might benefit from. And all of these were written in past generations, but they all have stood the test of time. Really solid works. The Attributes of God by A.W. Pink. The Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer. And then if you're looking for something really thorough on the attributes of God and the doctrine of God, consider the classic work, The Existence and Attributes of God by Charnock, who was a Puritan. It's still, to this day, one of the most helpful and devotionally full works on this subject. Okay, so let's jump in. I want to give you the last few absolute attributes of God. We've already discussed a number of them. For example, we've talked about God's simplicity, God's aseity, God's immutability, his impassibility, his infinity, and his eternality. We've talked about God being our eternal God. So here's a few more absolute attributes of God that you need to be familiar with. God's spirituality, or his invisibility. As many catechisms remind us, God is spirit, and he does not have a body like a human. More technically, God is more excellent than any other sort of existence. He's not made of any matter, he has no dimension, and in his total essence, he is unable to be perceived by normal human senses, unless he chooses to manifest himself in some analogical way by means of revelation. I've got a number of passages listed here for you that you can turn to if you want to do some more study on this. But let me just read a couple. John chapter 4, verse 24. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And then 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 16. God, who alone has immortality, who dwells in unapproachable light, whom no one has ever seen or can see. But of course, remember in all of this that John chapter 1 tells us that Jesus Christ, who is God, has made God known. So we can know God through revelation, especially by means of special revelation focused on God the Son. God is spirit. God is invisible, yet we can know him. Next, God's omnipresence. When we say that God is omnipresent, we don't just mean that God chooses to be everywhere at the same time. In keeping with his spirituality and his infinite simplicity, God has no size or spatial dimensions, and therefore he can be present at every point of space with his whole being. He created space, just like he created time, and thus he's not limited by it. He's not limited by spatial constraint. Now, this doesn't mean that in the economy of salvation within human history, that God isn't present in special ways in various locations. For example, the temple. God is present in the temple in a special way to be with and to bless his people. But even then, we recognize, as the biblical authors recognize, that God cannot be contained in human temples or in anything that has been made or created. Psalm 139, verses 7 through 10. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, that is the grave, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. God is omnipresent. Next, God is omniscient. He fully knows all things actual and possible in one simple and eternal act, including himself. Now, it's that final phrase that is so incredible here, I think. God, who is infinite and perfect in every way, has perfect and infinite self-knowledge. You and I, not only are there so many things that we don't know about the world around us, we don't even know ourselves all that well. Yet God does. He knows everything and himself perfectly to infinity. And remember, God is never in the process of learning these things. He simply knows them all eternally, since he is God. Job 37, verse 16. Do you know the balancings of the clouds, the wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge? That is our God, perfect in knowledge. Furthermore, God is omnipotent. God is able to do all his holy will, and he has infinite power over all things that are proper objects of his power. In other words, God does not have the power to sin, as that would unravel the very essence of God. It's not a proper object of the power of God. But he is able, without any restraint or any obstacle, he's able to achieve his perfect and holy and righteous will. Jeremiah 32, verse 17. Ah, Lord Yahweh, it is you who have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. There is some, if you remember, analogical language and anthropomorphism. By your outstretched arm, nothing is too powerful for you. God is omnipotent. We're going to move now into what we call God's relative attributes. Remember, these are attributes that are more clearly seen or understood by God's relation with his creation. We're going to cover two of them now, and then the rest in our next session. These are a couple of attributes, these first two I'm going to give you, that are sometimes described as mental attributes of God. First, there is God's wisdom. God's wisdom. God acts with full knowledge and right values, always choosing the best goals and the best means to achieve those goals. It goes without saying that God's wisdom is so far above ours that we can't even really compare the two. And yet, doesn't it reflect so much about our sinfulness and our pride that we constantly question God's wisdom in the ways that our lives unfold? Romans 16, verse 27. To the only wise God be glory forevermore through Jesus Christ. God is wise. He's infinitely wise. Then we can speak of God's truthfulness or his faithfulness. God is the true God, meaning that all his knowledge, all his words, all his actions are true, and they are the final standard of truth. In all being, in all reality, he is the final standard of truth. He will always do what he has said. He will always fulfill what he has promised. And therefore, God is fully dependable. He can be counted on without question by his people. The famous passage here, of course, is Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. The steadfast love of Yahweh never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. And so here's the praise. Great is your faithfulness. Our God is faithful. And he is faithful because he is the only true God. John 17, verse 3. So we'll continue with more of God's relative attributes in our next session. But as we close, take a few moments to answer these practical questions. Would have been some times in your own life when, looking back, you recognize how much better God's wisdom was than your own wisdom? And what are some ways that he has proven himself faithful to you over the years?